Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome the moderator of the next session, Tom Clark.
Good morning. How is everybody? It's one of the most challenging things that you can do at any international gathering is to be the first panel up in the morning after an evening put on where the wine was free. Let's just put it that way. Anyway, so I welcome you all this morning. We are going to spend, I think, 90 fascinating minutes talking about something that we have all thought, everybody in this room has thought about at one time or another, and that is NATO. Not only the changing nature of the threats and the changing nature of what we have to concentrate on, but also its very future itself. You know, one of the interesting things when you're planning, whether it be military planning, social planning, economic planning, is that you look back at the creation, say, of an organization like NATO, and you've got to remember at that time, as with every single time in the history of mankind, people at that time thought that they were living in the modern age. The caveman thought that he was living in the modern age. When NATO was created, we decided collectively then that this was the most modern thing that we could possibly do, because after all, no human had lived after us at that point. So it comes back to the question of reform and how things develop. And how things develop depends on all the elements happening around you. The people who are going to be delving into these subjects at length, and I'd like to introduce them, first of all, starting at my left, a person who has become a good friend and one of the most respected people in Washington, now the president of the Brookings Institution, former retired General John Allen.
Thank you.
Sitting beside John, he is the Assistant Secretary General for Public Diplomacy of NATO, and that's Dacian Ilden, and I think I got that right. Tachan, I think is the right pronunciation. Yuri Luik is the Minister of Defense for the Republic of Estonia. And finally, at the far end of the panel, we have General Philip Breedlove, the former NATO Supreme Commander. And ladies and gentlemen, this will be your panel this morning. Before we get started with our conversation, let's start by just putting a little bit of this into context. I'll say GLOBSEC has the best music of any conference I've ever been to. Before we get started, or as we get started, let me put it this way. You are very much part of what we're going to be doing, and for all of you on your phones, there is something called Slido. I'm sure that in the other sessions, perhaps you've already used it. We're going to use it in a rather interesting way this morning. Not only do I encourage you to send me questions on Slido, it's pretty easy to operate. If you have any doubts about how it works, I'm sure there's somebody here who can tell you what the answer is. I'm not sure I'm the guy, but we'll work through it. But there's a number of things that we're going to do, so send me the questions by all means. The other thing I'd like to ask is that for you to participate in a couple of polls that we're going to be doing this morning. Polls on the very questions that the panel is going to be talking about. And in as much as the video was a sort of a visual setup for evolving threats and adaptive technologies for NATO, what I want to do was just to get a sense from you all here about where you start this conversation. And so let me ask for a poll for you to participate in. And that is on a scale of 1 to 5. And if you go to Slido, you'll see the poll there. You just go under poll. And on a scale of 1 to 5, how relevant do you think NATO is? 1 being we may as well sell the real estate and save some money, and 5 is that it's absolutely essential. So I'll give you a couple of minutes or a few minutes here just to see where people are. And then what we're going to do at the end of this session, we're going to take this same poll again to see if anything that you've heard this morning has moved your views one way or another. Well, so far this is good news for NATO. At least 50% of you think that it's absolutely essential. These numbers will keep on moving. So we'll just leave it up for right now so you can see as the votes come in exactly where we are. Now, let me start the conversation. And General Breedlove, let me start with you as the former Supreme Commander of NATO. This is still very much burning in your mind. The U.S., I think, in some respects, has really focused what is one of the key questions about the future of NATO and how it will be able to do its job, and in fact, how it's going to define itself for the future. And that is the whole question of money. Everything comes down to money. The United States, President Trump has made it very clear over and over again, as recently as yesterday, that there are some laggards, many, many laggards in the NATO alliance who are not meeting their commitment of 2% of GDP spent on their own military as a way of being eventually able to participate in NATO operations. I must admit, I'm from Canada, and I am part of the 0.9% club, but we are certainly not alone in this. It is a bipartisan issue. President Obama felt very much the same way. So this is not a right-left issue. This is very much an American issue, with which I might add the Secretary General of NATO agrees completely. The question I have for you is this. Do you feel that the members of the alliance who are not spending 2% right now, do they have the political will to do that?
So thanks for the question, and may I just point out a little bit of what we talked about in the anteroom. The 2% is incredibly important, but people often forget the second half of that equation. The 20% of 2% should be spent on recapitalization, kit, equipment, etc. And so, a 2% or an increase to 2% that was all about personnel and supporting personnel may not be where we need to go. We need desperately in NATO to recapitalize some fairly old fleets and get our overall readiness and responsiveness on those fleets up, and that's a part of that 20% investment. So I was actually at the Wales Summit, as you know, and sat in the room and listened to our leaders talk about the new commitment to attaining that 2%, or at least to drastically increasing over time investment. And I saw a very firm commitment at that time. Now, some of the time horizons were a bit stretched, and that would call into question a little bit the commitment to that. But I think what we've seen across from Wales to Warsaw and even beyond, especially as the new administration came in, is that we see many of the capitals making very firm and easy to understand publicly plans on how they get to increase spending. But you and I both know that we have nations that haven't fully committed in the short term to the 2%. Remember, they all did commit at Wales to 2% eventually. So I'm optimistic here. And as you have seen, yeah, there was some pretty tough language thrown around for a while, and I think that we see new energy in making this apparent and getting to it. And more importantly, I believe the nations themselves see the requirement. I mean, we have a non-partner to the east that has decided that force is back on the table for changing internationally recognized borders, that has a motivating effect. And so I think that I'm optimistic here rather than pessimistic.
I want to go to Yuri with a specific question about Estonia, but just while we're on the question of money, this is something that you deal with from a NATO perspective all the time. Let me throw you one of the arguments, happens to be from a former Canadian government, said, well, we don't have to pay the 2% because we provide higher range assets to NATO that doesn't require a full 2%. We're much more technical. And therefore, we have decided that 1% or slightly below 1% is fine. Are you optimistic the same way that General Breedlove is, or are you noticing some resistance?
Well, I'm also optimistic. First of all, we have to put the discussion in context. We are talking about burden sharing, and burden sharing is evaluated against the backdrop of three components: cash, capabilities, and contributions. 2% GDP for defense spending is essential, part of the Wales Pledge. And the second component is, as General mentioned, the capabilities, 20% of the 2% GDP. And the third component, contributions, is how allies contribute to different NATO operations and missions. Now, the trends are quite promising. Until 2014, there was a decline in defense spending from most of the allies. But since 2014, we see a gradual increase. In the last 3 years, the increase is about $46 billion. This year, 8 allies will be meeting the 2% GDP. And also, there is a systematic scrutiny among allies. So they share their plans, how they intend to meet the 2% and 20% benchmarks. So I must say that the trend is positive. We are not there yet, and there is a long way to go, but I think that the figures show us that all allies take it serious. And Secretary General is following this up in a very serious manner. Therefore, I agree with General when he said that this is and you said it as well, it's a bipartisan issue on the United States side, but also it is something that has been agreed by all allies in 2014, so it has to be delivered.
Let's wrap this up in a bow. And I suspect we're going to be coming back to this very question, especially the 20% that both of you have brought up for modernization. But if we're spending money, whether it be the 2%, whether we're meeting our targets of the 20%, a lot of it is focused on you, Yuri, and Estonia, the Baltic nations. Let me ask you this. NATO has got an operation right now in the Baltics, Operation Reassurance. A number of NATO countries are providing forces for that. It's a show of force to let the Russians know that we're not going to take this lying down. Are you convinced that if the tanks came rolling over that NATO would defend you?
We are convinced, and it is absolutely clear that if we wouldn't have been successful in 2002 in actually getting to the alliance, we would be in terrible trouble today. I mean, 2002 was a unique moment when all the stars were aligned. We were ready, we took the opportunity, and now we are part of this brave and famous organization, which we believe makes an absolutely necessary, 100% necessary contribution to European security and world security. Now it is clear that for us, the question is not only the eastern side of NATO. I mean, you mentioned that perhaps this funding or this money is somehow geared towards the Baltic states. This is highly debatable. I mean, for instance, the United States has a global posture, so it's very difficult to divide whether some of it is meant for the Baltic states as such. But it is true that the alliance has been successful in building up a deterrent in the eastern flank, because we have an opponent who is a country who can be deterred, a rational or more or less rational player, which is also very important. So I think in the East we have this great opportunity to deter the opponent if our deterrence is credible. And I think it is credible in some aspects and not credible in other aspects. In terms of enhanced forward presence, which during the Cold War was called tripwire, and now it's called trigger, we have brave nations standing in the front line. The British battalion in Estonia is 150 kilometers from the Russian border. And there is kind of what I would call the third pillar, which is theater-wide defense from the United States, the powerful assets the United States have in Europe, but more importantly around the world. But what we are missing, I believe, is the rapid reinforcement capabilities, which would be necessary if the trigger is triggered. So the question for us is, what the hell will happen if somebody pulls the trigger? Because we don't have troops which would be in appropriate readiness, capable in moving quickly. We haven't exercised that, and we have to assume that bringing the troops to the Baltic states will happen in a hostile or non-permissive environment. So this is a very complex issue. That's why one of the requests we are going with to the NATO summit in Brussels this summer is to emphasize that NATO should restore the so-called, which were during the Cold War called reforger exercises, or exercises where the actual reinforcement is exercised through command and control capabilities, transport, logistics, etc., etc. I think that is a piece we are absolutely lacking today, and we would need to develop that. Thank you.
And thank you, Yuri, because you did actually answer one of the questions that has come in via Slido. And that was the whole question of readiness and the question of that capability. General Allen, you've operated for so long with both hats that you've worn, now with the Brookings Institute, at that intersection of politics and security, and I think you've probably got as good a handle on it as anybody that I know. Let's just follow Estonia and the Baltics for a minute. And Yuri, the reason I said that it was the focus was not because the money was being raised specifically for the Balkans, but because that is our first and most immediate concern. And I don't mean to denigrate our concern about Ukraine at all, or Crimea, but yours is the most pressing at the moment. John, Estonia is still on the Russian grid. There are so many ties that remain that from an operational point of view, the Russians could take down the grid in a nanosecond if they wanted to, creating an even greater problem on the readiness scale and on the deliverability scale, logistical scale. Is Estonia, with all those complications that Yuri has talked about, is this the hill that the West is prepared to die on?
Short answer is yes. And if it isn't, then the question about that you began the panel with, is it time to turn out the lights and sell the real estate or not? If we're not prepared to make Latvia, Estonia, and Latvia, or Lithuania, the reason that NATO would defend NATO and activate Article 5 of the Washington Treaty, if we're not prepared to do that, then we are out of business. Any implication that if you don't pay your 2%, we might not be coming is a false implication from my perspective. The moment that we decide that Latvia, Lithuania, or Estonia is so close to Russia and so potentially vulnerable to Russia that we would not react in the most vigorous defensive manner possible by the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, then we are out of business. And from my perspective, you didn't ask me, but on a scale of 1 to 5, I think the relevance of NATO today is somewhere between 6 and 10, because the erosion of the international order, the challenges that we face due to the direct Russian influence operations in the United States and in Europe, the erosion of governance in the Middle East, the potential for economic catastrophe in Africa, there are very few bright lights still on this planet right now. And the combination of NATO and the EU right now is one of those bright lights. One of the things that we undertook a study last year for GLOBSEC, it was clear to us that in this increasingly uncertain world, this world of increasing challenge and danger, the closer that NATO and the EU can become, sharing certain capabilities and sharing those unique characteristics that build synergy, the more stability that we'll see in Europe and between the United States inside the Atlantic Alliance, and that stability pays off in other places around the world. So if we're not prepared to come help Latvia, Lithuania, or Estonia, then we ought to sell the real estate. But the moment that we convey that we're not, then our deterrence begins to collapse around our ears. And we have to be very clear and unambiguous that NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, will come to the defense of those 3 Baltic states in the event of a Russian attack.
And I guess so much of it depends on...
Can I just throw one thing in there?
Yeah, please, go ahead.
Key number 18. When the Crimea event started unfolding, the U.S. EUCOM commander, a guy named Phil, talked to the SACEUR, another guy named Phil, and 18 hours from go to show, U.S. Air Force F-15s from Lakenheath in the cap, armed, over Estonia. That is response. That is showing commitment.
What he said.
18 hours.
And that's an example of the good. I guess part of the problem, Takan, that you deal with is the political will of the nations to step up to the level of operation that both former generals are talking about. Takan, I just want to throw something at you because it's come through the questions that we've had. And can I just say that thank you for sending the questions. If you wouldn't mind putting your name on it, just so that we know exactly who the questions are coming from, that'd be very helpful for us rather than sending it in anonymously. A number of questions here about the very subject that all of you have brought up, and especially Yuri, and that is the state of readiness, the capability of a rapid response. What is NATO doing to correct that deficit?
Well, I think after the watershed year 2014, NATO has been doing a lot in strengthening its deterrence and defense. We talked about enhanced forward presence. We tripled the NATO response force. We also created the notion of spearhead force of 5,000 strength, which could be deployed within a very short time. But it is true that we need to focus more on readiness and reinforcement. And the upcoming Brussels summit meeting will provide an opportunity for leaders to take decisions on that. In several ways. We talk about adaptation of NATO, and I fully agree with General Allen that NATO is more relevant than ever. And the reason is, in its history for almost 70 years, it has been adapting itself continuously. We remember after the end of the Cold War how we adapt ourselves to have out of area operations. We all know how we could be able to enlarge with open door policy. These all show NATO's ability to provide security, safety, and to promote peace. Now, for readiness and reinforcement, we should also take as part of the adaptation process the new command structure of NATO, which would be hopefully endorsed by the leaders in Brussels summit meeting. We are talking about three important components in the NATO command structure. One would be Atlantic Command, which will be focusing on maintaining safe sea lines of communication between Atlantic and Europe. Second component would be Command for military mobility in Europe. And third, Cyber Operations Center to be created to sharpen our capacity in cyber defense. But more and more we will be focusing in logistics, reinforcement, cyber, hybrid threats, and these are key areas for the alliance to sharpen its capacity. It is true that NATO has done a lot insofar as the eastern flank is concerned, but we shouldn't forget about the south. We always say that NATO is capable to respond to any threat coming from any direction, 360-degree approach. And for the south also, projecting stability beyond our borders, engaging with our partners, not only from the south but from the east, to strengthen their capacities so that they are more resilient to deal with different challenges and threats, first and foremost against terrorism. NATO is making quite a big effort, and cooperating with the European Union is also key in all these efforts.
And that brings up an interesting topic, but John, you wanted to get into this.
Sure, and we ought to come back to this issue of projecting stability, because I think that's really a critical subject. I think one of the realities of 2%, and I have to once again thank Secretary General Stoltenberg. His comment about paying 2%, and I know there's no science really behind that number. It was a number that all of the parties agreed to. His comment was, we, the NATO partners, ought to be paying 2%, even apart from the American pressure. So his view is, and I think it's an important view, and I think all 29 members believe it, it's an essential number to contribute. From my perspective, as I watch this, and General Relove, Phil touched on it, if all the partners pay 2%,
realization among our European partners that we need to develop capability on the continent by nations that may have felt protected in the past, but now understand we have to buy time and space to reinforce. And so that puts some, I think, new thinking into the equation. And so I think that we have the dynamic that you described in a lesser way than we used to. There's a little more need for speed, if you'll allow me to be glib. And so I see that trend reversing a bit. I didn't say earlier, but this would be an appropriate time to say it. Well, yes, America has been a huge part of what the defense looks like. But when Captain Phil Breedlove stood on the inter-German border in the mid-'80s, the first time serving with the U.S. Army, I had other large forces around me from other European leaders. And those forces have gone extremely down from their status at that time. And I think that, yes, we still will have an America that is very important to this equation. But I would like to see some big leaders in Europe take up this mantle and lead the way in saying we have to be better prepared internally here on the continent as well, especially to buy space and time.
Just, John, before you get into it, go ahead. Yeah.
I think the presence of the United States in Europe is really heavily validated by our historic experience, which is, as you know, the United States has left Europe several times and has been forced to come back with combat, which is always more expensive in blood and treasure. The involvement of the United States, in fact, is such a heavy deterrent that it is the best way to avoid war. So almost whatever it costs or how expensive it is, and I'm not glib about the 2%. Estonia, as you know, is fulfilling the 2% and the 20% investment requirement. But whatever we spend today is cheap compared to what could happen if the deterrent is not serious enough. And if you look at it from Moscow's side, and I've been Estonian ambassador to Moscow as well, so I have that certain insight. From the Moscow's point of view, the deterrent is the United States. And one has to keep in mind that Russia has been developing in its defense capabilities as we speak here, as we discuss these issues, very, very rapidly. And Russia today has capabilities which are in par with many of the modern Western capabilities we relied on. And in some areas, like air defense or electronic warfare, I would say they surpass the Western community already. So really, our possibility to create a credible deterrent is jointly with the United States. There is no other way. But I would say that this relationship has been very beneficial also to the United States. I mean, to have allies in the world who think like you is very important in times of crisis. Because in times of crisis, there's no time to negotiate. You have to believe that your friends understand you, even without long winding discussions, because you share the same values. And I think there is a very good example now, which is the military actions taken by the United States in Syria, where it was necessary, and those countries wanted to be involved in this operation. It gave the operation much higher legitimacy and also showed the readiness of Europeans to be involved, not only in Europe, but in solving crises in other parts of the world. Finally, let me say a point about speed. I entirely agree with the General that speed is of the essence. I would like to remind the audience that if you read the NATO treaty and Article 5, you will see that NATO countries have a collective responsibility among each other to move, but they also have a bilateral responsibility to each other, a bilateral defense clause. It is very clear in the treaty. So that was very much the legal basis of how the United States was ready to move so quickly without any NATO Council decision, based on our, I would say, bilateral commitment. This is very important. We in Estonia, for us, this is extremely important. And that's why we go to missions with the United States, with Great Britain, with France, also to foster these bilateral relationships. It's not only an organizational matter, it's a matter between two nations or several nations.
I know, John, you want to...
I'll try to be quick as I can on this. Just to the point about the U.S. connectivity back into the old reforger, which was reinforcement of Germany exercises. Just last week, if I'm not mistaken, the U.S. activated the second fleet, reactivated the second fleet, which is our Atlantic fleet, which gives us the capability to oppose a far more modernized and sophisticated Russian Navy in the event that we've got to come, number one. Number two, speed over the ground is important, but speed in decision making is essential. And part of the deterrent value of NATO is a direct linkage and connectivity between the capacity of NATO leadership to make decisions and how that decision can ultimately be implemented. It's also crucial that the NATO nuclear deterrent be linked to the conventional deterrent, and over time they have become delinked. And so the speed of decision making, the linkage vertically from the decision through the conventional all the way to the nuclear threshold and across it if necessary, that's deterrence. And one of the things that really comes to the fore, and it goes again to Yuri's points, is we have to be able to operate across all 6 domains now, the 4 traditional domains, the domain of space and the domain of cyber. And we have to be able to defend credibly in all 4 of those domains and then conduct active operations, if necessary, in all 6 of those domains. I said 4, I meant 6. And that means that NATO has to embrace the reality of emerging technologies. And in particular, the things that we can achieve through artificial intelligence in the context of both intelligence detection and analysis and decision support can be enormously accelerated and supportive to not just our decision making, but also our hyperwar type operations. And then the final point, if I can remember what it is interoperability. Commanding the force in Afghanistan, I would say that every NATO partner that we had who served on the ground in Afghanistan would say that at the end of all of those years, we, the soldiers of Latvia, we, the soldiers of Turkey, we, the soldiers of whatever, we feel a capacity for interoperability we've never seen before. Now, we don't have an operation like that right now, but any series of resource and requirements decisions of NATO and any exercise program that isn't driven relentlessly towards the capacity to be interoperable and to sustain interoperability shortcuts our ability to have the credibility that we have to be able to respond in time.
And it's interesting that you bring that up because it sort of comes back to the 2%. I know Pascal Heyman sent in a question. We don't have to deal with it, but I do want to just put the subject on the table. And that is that when we account for the 2%, those new areas that you talked about, General, such as cyber, is the 2% cognizant of the fact that that spending on cyber, just spending on anti-terrorism is part of your 2%. In other words, do we have to redefine a little bit what that 2% accounting system actually is? I do want to...
let me just say yes, and I think NATO's actually moving out pretty smartly on a lot of these things. We should always ask ourselves the question, are we moving fast enough?
Right. And to that extent, there's 2 things that I want to do. I want to go back to this... if you take, I think it's the question from Mario. And Mario, thank you very much. What can everybody in this room do now to make NATO more fit for today and tomorrow, considering that a great number of people in this room are actually in a position to do exactly that? And if I could ask for a very brief response and perhaps prioritize it, just give me the one thing that you think that the folks here can do to promote the solutions that you've all been talking about. And General Breedlove, if I could start with you on that.
Yeah, so John stole one of my key points, and that is, and I like it when he does that because that means we think alike. One of my greatest frustrations as the SAC here is what I call decision speed. Can we decide at the speed of the threat?
Right.
We've made some adaptation to NATO in Wales and Warsaw, and we're getting far better at being able to rapidly deploy forces. We haven't exercised at massive scale, I agree, but we have exercised at appropriate scale according to cost and other things. And I think at this point we would find that what slows us down more than anything in reacting to a threat will be the decision. So decision speed, and frankly this sounds very self-serving, but giving the SAC your back the ability to get forces moving to get to the threat while the deciders begin to decide, I think that's key and essential.
Yuri, one thing that these people can do to modernize?
The easiest way would just be to sign up to what General Breedlove said. Perhaps I would add one more component, which is really everybody who is pro-NATO.
Yesterday I attended a meeting of young leaders, and I was impressed with the level of discussion, and we need to engage with them and the value of spending enough for our defense.
I'm going to stop there, and John, I'm not going to cut you off, but because Tachin, you said we've got to engage with them, my job is to make sure that the audience now engages with you. And I'm sure these topics are going to come up. Just before we start the engagement, Robin, you're on the list. I want to do one other thing with your phones. And if you could go back to the Slido site, what I'd like you to do, and this is a word cloud that I think will be very instructive for the discussion. Use 2 words that you think pose the greatest threat to the future of NATO. Either its existence or its operations. We've heard a few up here, rapid response capabilities, that sort of thing. But I'd be interested in what the overall view of the room is in terms of what you see as the things that we should be focusing on that are critical for the success of the mission of NATO. And as we do that, and as that is being populated, and we'll see it up on the screen here, time to go to the audience. And those of you who have seen me in this position before know that I have a little thing that I say at the beginning. I sort of need to hear the formation of a question within the first 20 seconds. If I don't hear the formation of a question, you can be guaranteed that I will interrupt you and encourage you to get to the question as quickly as possible. We may bunch a bunch of questions together because I want to make sure that everybody has an opportunity to ask a question or make a very brief, concise statement that the panel can then engage with. So with that warning out there, I will start, first of all, Robin Shepherd. If we could bring a microphone too. Sir.
Tom, thank you very much, and great to see you here in Bratislava. I wanted to turn the discussion to NATO and Ukraine. Minister Luik, you rightly, in my opinion, referred to the fact that if Estonia had not been a member of NATO, all sorts of things could have gone very badly wrong in your country. We all remember here the 2007 cyber attack, which alerted anybody who was not undergoing deep sleep therapy that there was a threat to the east. Ukraine is a very fraught situation. The United Nations monitoring mission calculates between April 2014 and November 2017, 10,300 deaths.
Therefore?
10,303 if you want the exact number.
Therefore?
Pardon. Therefore, the question is, as a matter of the will and the existential necessity of NATO, do the panelists believe that, as John McCain said in this very setting 2 or 3 years ago, that actually there is still a prospect of NATO joining, of Ukraine joining NATO, or is that simply pie in the sky, and we shouldn't be putting that forward to raise hopes that will never finally be delivered?
Let me, with that in mind, and everybody took notes, do you mind if we just sort of bunch 1 or 2 comments together, and then we'll deal with all of them? Sir, I think you were up next, right behind you, Robin, if you could pass the microphone back. Just identify yourself if you can.
Yes, good morning. I'm General Camporini, former Chief of Defense, retired, of course. And my question is related to the quality of spending. General Breedlove said it's more important the 20% on investing than the 2% in general. I'm more concerned about the readiness of our forces, because we are spending somehow a lot of money on salaries, a lot of money, a fairly lot of money on modernization. We are not spending on training and maintenance, and the result is that if we are called together, our forces will be very lean because not very many aircraft, ships, and tanks will be ready for employment.
Thank you, General, and we'll put one more. Yes, sir. If we could just pass that microphone. Thank you.
Jonathan Isle from Russia in London. I wonder if this discussion about the northern flank, if one could use the old term, is a bit like the Maginot Line, namely a discussion at the wrong time, in the wrong place, and for the wrong purpose. All the threats that NATO faced in the last few years have been in the south. Georgia 2008, Ukraine 2014, Syria 2015, a clash between Russia and Turkey later on. So are we in a healthy state in what used to be called the southern flank of the alliance, especially if it's an alliance of values, as our Turkish colleague said?
Thank you very much. So in order, we have Ukraine, we've got where the money has gone, and the southern flank. Let's start with the question of Ukraine, because that's been bedeviling us for a while, and I don't mean to say that Ukraine is more important than what's happening in the Baltics, but we actually have a lot of shooting going on. Yesterday, I heard from the OSCE, the Organization for Cooperative and Security in Europe, that there were 2,904 violations just yesterday of the ceasefire, 1,200 of them with heavy weapons. There is no peace to keep in Ukraine right now. So picking up on what Robin was saying, does anybody want to start that? Yes, sir, go ahead.
For Ukraine, yesterday there was a discussion here, and I agree with the panelists of that discussion that Minsk agreements should be implemented fully to have a sustainable ceasefire, and also for all Donbas region institutions to function properly. Now, regarding the membership aspirations of Ukraine, NATO is committed to what the leaders had decided in 2008 at Bucharest summit meeting. And right now we have quite an extensive engagement, partnership relationship with Ukraine. And Ukraine has all the tools to make a progress, be it NATO-Ukraine Commission, the Comprehensive Assistance Package, which was adopted at the Warsaw Summit meeting. So Ukraine has to make progress in all areas of reform agenda, and they are doing what they can, but we always encourage them to do more. And at this stage, I think we should also be cognizant of the importance of expectation management. We should not create expectations when not fulfilled, then deep frustrations come up. So we need to continue engaging with them. We are working with Ukraine in many areas, and a number of nations are supporting trust funds, and in key areas we are strengthening their capacities for them to be able to address major security challenges and threats.
Let me just bring Yuri into this. Yuri, you had something to say?
Yeah, on Ukraine, I have always told to my Ukrainian friends, don't be in despair on this issue, because when the Baltic states started their movement towards NATO, if we would have polled in the group of experts, I think everybody would have said no, no way. And now we are in the alliance. So you never know. But the trick is to be ready at the very point when the window opens. If you are not ready then, politically, economically, militarily, then the window closes very quickly. But if you are ready, people will dust off the Bucharest Treaty and will use the wording which has been forgotten by many people, that Georgia and Ukraine will be in NATO full stop. They will use the same wording and say, hey guys, we've basically decided it already. What's the problem? So I think that is the context. On the other hand, obviously, future membership of Ukraine in NATO doesn't help them today. So I think it's very important that we put a lot of political support behind Ukraine, and I think the fact that President Trump's administration finally decided to send the Ukrainian army Javelin anti-tank weapons. I mean, for $50 million, these anti-tank weapons do not necessarily provide a very substantial capability, but as a political message, this is absolutely, absolutely important. What I'm afraid today, I'm being very honest here, is the fact that the latest developments on the Iran portfolio, in whatever way you look at the particulars of the Iran issue as such, you are facing a situation whereby Russia has gained, if you will, kind of new energy and new opportunities from that political change. And you see Chancellor Merkel and President Putin meeting in Sochi today, and there is a lot of development. I very much hope that we keep the Iran portfolio and the Ukraine portfolio separately, because I'm sure there will be people who will be gunning for some type of trade-off. When it comes to the South, to the sort of quote-unquote real issues, I think it is peaceful in the North, largely because we have been successful in the North, and we have been clear and forceful in the North. I absolutely agree that we should be equally clear and forceful in the South, but as you know, there is a conceptual issue, which is how much of that can be done with military tools and how much with other tools. So in some ways, NATO is not very well equipped to operate there, but there are things we can do, like training the local forces, providing logistics support, etc., etc.
Let me just, so you as panelists can have a sense of what the mood in the room is on what we're talking about. Let's go to that word cloud that you all helped to populate. And there it is right in the middle, biggest threat, Russia, mentioned by more than a few of you. But look at that, internal disunity is probably the number 2 concern about the future. And to the general's question about where the money goes and how the money is spent to do all these things, whether it's on the South, the East, the West, this all takes money. And maybe to your point, sir, if there is a crisis, at least all the ambassadors will be arriving in very nice cars to the meeting. But if you wanted, you know, that's an essential question. We're talking about the money. How is the money being focused? Where is it going? And if there is internal disunity, I would suggest that perhaps just one of the aspects of internal disunity is over the definition of what NATO should be doing. How far should it extend itself? Because there are certainly limits, as there are to anything, when you're dealing with money. So, large question. But, John, have you got some thoughts?
Sure, absolutely do. And we talked about the South. From my perspective, the South really is the true southern flank of NATO. And the idea, as the ambassador said, about projecting stability, in my own sense is that the steps underway within NATO right now to deter Russia are in train. I don't think any of us are satisfied that we're near the end state for that comprehensive set of activities to be done anytime soon, but I think the trajectory has a deterrent effect in and of itself. The thing you can't deter is the refugee crisis. Refugees can't be deterred. And my continued concern is that the instability in the Middle East, the potential for economic catastrophe in Africa, which could bring those two together, which could bring refugee columns in the tens of millions out of Africa and out of the Middle East, I think is a real threat to not NATO, but to Europe. And this goes to the issue in the word cloud about the political unity. Because what's happened here is what we've seen is the combination of the Russian influence operation, the general drift towards rightist, populist, nativist politics, has either been a reaction to or been exacerbated by the migrant and refugee crisis. It has opened societal and religious divisions within Europe, which have been seized by certain political parties to achieve their political objectives, and that has had a disintegrating is too strong a term, but it has begun to strike a blow internally at the politics of some of the NATO states, and in doing so, it has created unity issues within NATO and the EU. And I think we cannot overstate the importance of this as being a long-term threat to NATO. Again, the Russian military threat is one that I think in the end we will handle in some form or another. But this idea of projecting stability and projecting capability, which has to be a unity of NATO and the EU and the broader community of nations into these regions, either to facilitate conflict termination or population stabilization or economic development, get upstream from the fight and deal with those causal factors that put millions of people on their feet to flee conflict or flee economic catastrophe. And if we don't do that, NATO is going to have to deal with one refugee wave after another. And we'll deter Russia, but we'll begin to see the politics within Europe react to that in ways that has a real disuniting or even potentially disintegrating impact. And I really worry about that.
General Breedlove, have you got a thought?
Yeah, I'll just briefly add, because very good things have already been said. In fighter pilot short terms, the tools are different in the South than in the North. And frankly, in my opinion, when it comes to just military capability, infrastructure, etc., we're far better set in the South because we've had this long-term relationships with basing and forces all along the northern edge of the Mediterranean. So I understand the division of concern, but I think that we have to be a little more nuanced in how we see what we need to move forward in the South, and I think that's very key. General, I hope I didn't misstate. I did not say that 20% is more important. I just said that we often forget that that's the second rule, and it is absolutely important. I think our chiefs of defense now are faced with sort of three things, and you laid it out well. Today's readiness and responsiveness, remember responsiveness, our recapitalization. It's sad to say that we have partners that are sometimes more interoperable with NATO than some of our internal NATO allies because of fleet types, fleet capabilities. And we have partners that are fighting at the leading edge of technology with us. And we need to get better at that internally. So that recapitalization. And then it's also the decision, as you sort of mentioned, about the long term. We have to begin now preparing what NATO next looks like. We have seen recently in the Syria strikes and others that in some cases we're going to need our very best equipment, our sort of fifth gen equipment, to be able to take out some of these new threats and do it well. And so three bends: today's readiness and responsiveness, recapitalization of the fleets now that may not even be interoperable, and thinking about what we need to look like in the future. I think that's where we need to be dividing our attention.
And I think, and I'm delighted that these new threats have been brought up, especially, John, you're talking about the migrant issue, which is going to dominate politically, incidentally, not just in Europe, but apparently in the United States as well.
Yeah.
And, you know, the cyber question is enormous. The Russians have shown that they can cut off our supply lines at will, and they've done it. They stopped FedEx. And it seemed to me that that was sort of a bit of a warning shot across our bows. And we haven't even talked about Turkey yet, which I think is probably a key issue. What do you do when one of your members goes a little bit off? That's an editorial comment of mine, and I apologize to anybody from Turkey, but they're a little off. Sorry, go ahead, Tatya.
Well, first of all, a couple of points on projecting stability. I fully agree with my fellow panelists about the importance of engaging with partners in training activities. And in fact, for the Brussels summit meeting, we aim at launching a training mission in Iraq. We are in the planning stage. At the same time, defense capacity building efforts in Jordan and Tunisia is quite important. And when we see the nature of threats emanating from the south, they are very complex, and it requires a comprehensive approach, which means we need to have a proper cooperation, engagement with other international actors, and first and foremost with the European Union, to join forces in addressing some of the important threats like countering terrorism. And it is one of the areas of cooperation between the two organizations. And the Secretary General aims at signing a new joint statement with Presidents Tusk and Juncker during the Brussels summit meeting.
Great.
And it would be quite important to strengthen this strategic partnership between the two organizations. Now, talking about Turkey, I'm from Turkey, but I'm representing NATO, so I will stick to the lines of the Secretary General. As Secretary General says, Turkey is a valued ally, making a substantial contribution to NATO operations and missions. When we talk about the challenges and threats emanating from the south, the AVAX flights are conducted from Airbase Konya in Turkey, and it supports the activities of the global coalition against ISIS. And in every operation and mission of NATO, Turkey has substantial contributions. Now, at the same time, we have to recognize the difficulties that Turkey is going through, especially due to the location of the country. Neighbors, Syria and Iraq, they are not stable, and it poses an existential problem for Turkey. And there hasn't been an allied country who suffered more than Turkey when it comes to terrorist attacks. So it is a big challenge that has to be recognized, but nobody denies the importance of the values that we all share, and Turkey also is part of this family, so upholding these values is as important as for any ally, for Turkey as well.
And I'm just going to ask you to hold that last thought, because I'm conscious of our time, and I do want to get the audience more involved. What I'd like to do is do another cluster of questions, and we will all deal with it as efficiently as we can. Yes, ma'am, let's start with you. And again, the 20-second rule is still in effect, just so you know.
Thanks a lot. Hanna Shellis, Ukraine Analytica. You were talking a lot about the deterrence in the Baltics. What about the Black Sea? I mean, you have 3 Black Sea littoral states being members of the NATO, but still de facto absence of the NATO strategy for the Black Sea. And I'm speaking not about Ukraine and Georgia politics of NATO, but about the maritime security and the new threats appearing there, as none of the initiatives are working anymore that we had before, like the Black Sea Harmony or Black Sea 4.
Thank you very much. Yes, sir, in the middle. It'll take us a second to get you a microphone. There it is. Just identify yourself in 20 seconds.
Martin Michelot, Europom Institute for European Policy in Prague. The Assistant Secretary General hinted at it, but I wanted to come to the question of military mobility. I know it's a big item on the agenda of EU-NATO cooperation, and I know it's an agenda that was important for Secure. I wanted to ask you if you could please pinpoint a couple of the hot points of this military mobility discussion, explain to us the importance of them, and also where the potential challenges still remain. Thank you very much.
Thank you, and just to amplify your question a little bit, there was another question that came in on Slido, which talked about the mobility issue, especially delaying the movement of troops across a Schengen border, which seems a little bit odd, but anyway, that was a real thing that happened. One more question. Yes, ma'am.
Hi, Rachel Rizzo with the Center for New American Security. You mentioned training mission in Iraq and command structure reform, but can you highlight some of the other accomplishments or some of the goals that the Alliance should aim to accomplish at the upcoming summit this July in Brussels? Thank you.
Thank you so much, Rachel. Well, there we go. We've got three big topics on the table here. Let's actually start, if you don't mind, with the last one, which has to do with Iraq, and John, you've got some experience in that area. Do you want to handle that one?
When I was designated as the special envoy to the global coalition about ISIL, I went straight into Baghdad and met with Haider al-Abadi, the prime minister, who's new to the job. And with no prompting whatsoever, he said to me that one of his objectives while he was the prime minister of Iraq was to reinvigorate, re-energize the Iraqi-NATO relationship. And we've had a training mission in Iraq before, and indeed when we worked to build up during this most recent war the Iraqi police, which were going to be a critical capability, because of the relationship of the Iraqi Ministry of Interior and the Italian Carabinieri, who had been magnificent trainers for the Italian police, that legacy created an immediate desire and an immediate deployment by Italy of police to come help. So there is a bias, happily and favorably, in Iraq for a NATO training mission. There are others in this room or on this panel who can talk about this, what the size of that ought to be. My fear is that it could be too small. And in an environment where the outcome of the war against ISIL may ultimately appear to be a diminished U.S. presence, I think we could really compensate for a smaller U.S. presence by having the right-sized NATO presence over time. One of the things I said to Abadi when we got on with this, there was a lot of question about having the Westerners are back. There was a lot of concern about that, particularly in the Shia political realm. My comment to him was, you can't look at the coalition helping you to fight the Islamic State solely in terms of military capacity. Iraq needs to perceive that we were 65 nations then, I think we're 70-some number now. You need to perceive of all of those nations as being willing to help Iraq, not today, but in the future. So let's think about Iraq's future in the context of coalition support. And here is a really tangible example of coalition support for Iraq over the long term, to include, not intentionally, but implicitly minimizing Iranian support by having a robust NATO presence there to train and continue the professional development of the Iraqi military and police.
I don't want to cut off any more conversation about Iraq, but General Breedlove, I wanted to throw the Black Sea question, or direct it to you, and of course anybody else, feel free to join in. You know, on top of what was brought up, the question of close encounters is an increasing issue in the Black Sea area. We're talking about encounters of mere meters between aircraft and ships and that sort of thing. What's your take on that? 3 nominal members of NATO on the Black Sea. What are we doing?
So I hate to keep saying it, but I'm a little more optimistic than maybe this was stated about the Black Sea. I mean, the United States has shown a firm commitment in the Black Sea and has 4 very capable Aegis platforms that routinely patrol and go in there and train and interact, and those ships were put there with that as one of their explicit missions, is to continue to show freedom of navigation, exercising, and engagement in the Black Sea. But I'll also be the first one to say it's not enough. The Black Sea nations need to come along beside us. And in general they are, but the fleets are small, and part of what needs to be looked at for recapitalization of our nations in the Black Sea area. And then, as most on the panel know, I've served a good piece of my life in Turkey, many months, over a year's worth of time at Incirlik in aggregate, in Northern Watch and alerts and things over the years. And so I have a great respect for our Turkish allies and what they do. But the Montreux Convention and our interaction with Turkey provides also some interesting dilemmas for NATO in the Black Sea, limiting our ability to really build the fleet sizes and exercise sizes that we need. And so this is a place where I think as we continue to work forward with our great ally in Turkey, we need to be expanding with them how we can better utilize the Montreux Convention to allow NATO to do the things that it needs to do in the Black Sea.
Just jumping to the third question, because I do want to do another round. Sorry, yeah, Yuri, and I was going to pose it to both of you, the hot points of the mobility issue, but Yuri, go ahead.
On mobility, I think we are making major progress now when it comes to military mobility, because we have a situation whereby there is a real issue and there is a real readiness from both NATO and the European Union to join it. So I would say this is perhaps one of the first good examples of how NATO and EU share interests and come together on a really important strategic point. On the EU side, I tip my hat to the enormous enthusiasm there is among the members, from north to south, from east to west. Really, there's a unique feeling of political unity. But as always, the devil is in details. I mean, in general terms, you understand that if there is an echelon of tanks coming to your way, even if they are allies, you would need some readiness to protect this echelon, to know whether there is ammunition involved, etc., etc. But we seriously believe that this can all, because they are your allies, be done in a quick, standardized way, so a permit to cross the border can be given in a very short time frame. What I'm afraid of is, and this is the typical EU thing, that the whole project is sort of melting into various agencies, because it has so many facets now, starting from entering the country to strengthening bridges, to strengthening rail lines, etc., etc. My request is that we would move quickly and grab low-hanging fruits as much as possible. And there is a great Dutch idea now on the table that this summer both EU and NATO would make something called mobility pledge, which would essentially agree on a couple of simple things. One of them, a permit to cross the border should be given in maximum 5 days. That would already be a great step forward, not for Estonia, I mean we can do it significantly quicker, but for many countries this is a major step forward. And there are other things which really can be done very quickly, intergovernmentally, governments just agreeing and declaring their readiness. So I think that should be the way forward.
Yeah,
just an important point of emphasis, and I agree with what was said, and I want to pile on a small point of it. I am now much more convinced that we're going to get to the right policy, although I don't think 5 days is fast enough for me.
No way.
And I don't think General Scaparrotti would think. I can't speak for for him, but SCAP, I think, would want more quicker than 5 days. But another important point that was touched on is Captain Phil Breedlove in the 1980s could roll up to a bridge, and he had great confidence that the little circle with the 5.5 on it meant a certain size vehicle could go across that bridge. Very few bridges have been surveyed since those days. Do we have any confidence at all that we understand the physics of the move, not the policy of the move? And this is something the EU could help us with greatly. And frankly, individual nations could begin now doing those surveys. And if it was as simple as, I can't do my whole country at once, but if I provide a main supply route north or whatever we need and a main supply route east, that you can count on that your Leopards, your M1A3s, your MRAPs, etc. can go this route. That's a big step forward, and this is something that the nations can begin to do now without having to strike any new policy positions, is to get out there and begin to look at the physics of the move.
I'm just going to, I'm coming to you next, Tekan, but because we're sort of coming near the end, I just want to go back to the original poll that we started with, and let me put up, that was the result at the beginning of our conversation this morning. 58% of you thought that NATO was of great importance. Nobody thought that we should shut the place down. What I'd like you to do now, on the basis of what you've heard, if you wouldn't mind going back to that poll and re-voting. And it'll be an interesting exercise to see where we end up. Well, 100% of you so far have been convinced. We're going to keep that going, but please vote. We've got 5 minutes left, and we're going to keep on looking at this. It won't be too much of a distraction. But I wanted to give all of our panelists one sort of last comment, and you can dwell on absolutely anything that you want to talk about. But if I could ask you to keep it to 2 minutes, and then we'll be within our time limits. And Tekan, because I promised, you are up, sir.
Yeah. Well, for the summit meeting and what could be expected, I already mentioned that strengthening deterrence and defense would be one important theme. Second would be projecting stability and enhancing NATO's role in countering terrorism. The third would be NATO-EU cooperation, and I fully agree with what has been said on military mobility, and I consider this to be one flagship project between the two organizations. Fourth would be modernization, adaptation, and NATO command structure being endorsed by leaders. This is our expectations, would be an important deliverable. We are also working on institutional adaptation, functional review, which also would address speed of decision making, which was touched upon on a number of occasions. And burden sharing would be an important item. NATO-Russia relations, of course, would be in the discussions. We have a dual-track approach, meaning stronger deterrence and defense, but meaningful dialogue with Russia. For Black Sea, I think since the Warsaw summit meeting, we have made quite important steps with tailored forward presence for Black Sea. There is a tailored forward presence land component around the multinational brigade in Romania. We have more naval presence in the Black Sea. I know that Turkey is contributing with maritime patrol flights. So Black Sea has not been neglected. There is a constant assessment and situational awareness for the region. And one last thing perhaps is that NATO-EU cooperation, talking about it, I have to emphasize 3 points. One would be we always talk about complementarity and to avoid duplication. and it is good to see European Union developing PESCO and European Defence Fund, and it would also contribute to some of the questions that we have discussed, burden sharing, more capabilities. So these are positive things that NATO recognizes, but we should keep in mind that we should not have two sets of requirements.
That's right.
There should be a coherence in the work of two organizations, and we should always remember that NATO will remain as the cornerstone of European defense. Second important issue would be to make sure that whatever capabilities are developed within the European Union could be available for NATO's use. And third, the involvement of non-EU allies in all these initiatives, and taking into consideration that with Brexit, the United Kingdom will also be a non-EU ally. Involvement of non-EU allies would be an important issue.
Okay, I've got to play ringmaster here because we're just about out of time, and apparently the hall has been rented out for a wedding, so we have to leave. It was interesting in your response. There were more of you who became true believers. However, I did notice that 2% of you say it's time to shut things down. So, in fact, the conversation today did move some public opinion on this matter among people who are very committed to the ideas, if not perhaps with the 2%, the way that it's being done. I would like to just take a moment here to thank a really quite incredible panel that GLOBSEC put together for this. Phil Breedlove, General Breedlove, excuse me, and Yuri Luik, your comments have been especially germane to what is going on and what is part of the broader NATO conversation right now. Takan, thank you so much for expressing what is really at the heart of the strategy right now, the public strategy of NATO and the public diplomacy. And as always, General John Allen, you bring such a wealth of experience to these conversations. And now as the president of the Brookings Institution, we continue to be able to benefit from that. So thank you all very much. I just wanted to say one thing that wasn't done at the very beginning was telling you who the hell I am. So I may as well tell you. So I'm Tom Clark. I'm the chairman of Global Public Affairs. We're based in Canada. We have offices in many parts of the world. And we are an animator of public policy, public discussion, and public advocacy. Thank you all very much. As you can tell from the noise that the tent has been making, if you run into the Wicked Witch of the West and Munchkins outside, you'll understand that we are no longer in Kansas. As the movie goes, it's apparently quite windy out there. As a couple of housekeeping matters, refreshments are available just inside the hotel, but please let me remind you to be back in your seats in half an hour at 11 o'clock. Oh, good. 11 o'clock for the GLOBSEC session with two prime ministers, two. And I don't know whether that's primes ministers or prime ministers. And at the same time, in the Habsburg room, the subject is the green economy. So there's lots ahead. Once again, ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for your participation. I hope this has been enlightening and entertaining for you.